Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
Teachers, mark your calendars for Bet UK 2025, the world's biggest EdTech event. Join over 30,000 educators at the Excel London from the 22nd to the 24th of January. Discover the latest EdTech innovations, network with peers and access hundreds of hours of CPD. Did we mention it's 100% free for educators? Whether you're looking for inspiration or practical tools to enhance your teaching, Bet has it all. Don't miss this opportunity to shape the future of education. Register today at uk.betshow.com.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. You are very welcome, as always, to the conversation. We've got a show this evening all about digital technology and mobile phones. We're looking at schools that ban mobile phones, whether those bans are overreach or whether they are, in fact, the way forward for all concerned. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on: mobile phone use in schools, but particularly where the schools should be banning mobile phones as a whole school initiative. It is a very on-trend thing. Many schools are choosing to completely ban phones or ban them to a great extent from classrooms. So it's an interesting one. Do these bans work? Is it the way forward long term? What is the solution to the challenge, if you like, that comes with digital technology? And I've got two amazing experts within their own ways here this evening, and I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. Before I do that, it would be a great opportunity for me to just give a shout out to our sponsors this evening. We've got John Catt Educational, who are leading providers of professional development opportunities for teachers worldwide. If you want to find out more and get a book from John Catt, you can visit johncattbookshop.com and you can use the code JCTTR2425 to get 20% off any book or any number of books on the John Catt website. You can also check out Reading Solutions UK, who, courtesy of Teachers Talk Radio, are giving you a free 4-week pilot where you or your school can trial Reading Solutions UK for free for 4 weeks. They're the home of Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development program. I've tried the software. It's absolutely superb. You can use it from Key Stage 2 all the way through to GCSE and beyond. And it uses evidence-based adaptive technology to support students in their reading and to narrow skills gaps. So check it out, Reading Solutions. I think on X they are at Read Solutions UK if you want to follow them on there. So without further ado, I know that Professor Pete Etchells has already joined me. I'm just going to make sure that Pete can hear me. Pete, can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Now, listen, Pete, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on this evening and sort of share your expertise on this. I don't know whether you want to give a sort of introduction on yourself and what you do to start with?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. So yeah, I'm a professor of psychology and science communication. I'm at Bath Spa University in the UK. For about 10, 12 years now, I've been doing science communication, writing, thinking, doing research on screens generally. So trying to understand the effects of digital technology on things like behavior and mental well-being and things like that. I've written two books. So I wrote a book called Lost in a Good Game, which is about video games and what they can do for us, which came out about 5 years ago. And then this year I wrote, well, I didn't write it this year, but published a book this year called Unlocked: The Real Science of Screen Time and How to Spend It Better.
Yeah, and in general, you are sort of keen on reframing the conversation about how we use digital technology to improve our lives. Would that be right in a general sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think, if you look at the trajectory of how that general conversation has gone over the past 10 years or so, it's become increasingly fraught with panic and fear mongering and a real misunderstanding and a misrepresentation of the underlying science about what we know about digital technology effects. And I think that's been to our detriment as well. And I think we can all see that in the types of conversations that we've been having around digital tech over the past 6 months or so. There's a real sense of fear and urgency that we need to do something about this now that maybe isn't reflected in the scientific research.
Well, that's what I really wanted to open up this conversation with is tell us as teachers and educators a little bit around, I say a little bit, I want you to really delve into this for us around the research on mobile phone use by young people. Is it what it is reported to be, which is generally pretty negative, isn't it?
Yeah. There's definitely a negative framing to all of this, which I think is quite an unhelpful one as well. So I think part of the problem here is that we worry as parents and caregivers and teachers and people of that sort of generation, we worry about these sort of perceived effects of digital tech, whether we're talking about smartphones or social media or video games, things like that. We have this view of what they are that doesn't often tally with the reality of how children and young people actually use them. And that's not to say that there aren't things to worry about. Of course, there are. But this sense that there is some sort of emergency, some sort of mental health emergency that is directly the result of digital technology, it's just not something that's borne out by the research evidence, right? And this is something that I've been worrying about for a good while now, because if you take that view that that we are in an emergency, we need to do something now, you start latching on to solutions which feel as though they should work and feel as though they should do something, whereas perhaps in reality, we don't have the evidence for them, for whether they work or not. B, we don't know what problems they're going to fix. So we ultimately don't know whether they have unintended consequences down the line.
I know that some very prominent educators, take for example Catherine Bergelsing, has argued that smartphones hinder children's reading habits and their academic performance. She said, quote, they'll get to a point where they don't read at all. And she's cautioned around smartphones, saying that, quote, children will get the best possible GCSEs. They will know how to organize their time. They won't get addicted in regards to, the banning of mobile phones in school. So can you tell me a bit around, what do we know about the use of mobile phones, the use of digital technology by young people? Is it a bad thing? Tell me something around the research on it. Tell me something.
So I think this is probably a theme that's going to come up a lot, which is that, phones, social media, whatever it is that we're talking about, and I'll come back to that as well, because I think that point is important as well. What is it specifically that we're talking about or worried about? But these things are not inherently negative, right? So phones aren't firing out addiction rays and things like that, even though that's sometimes how they're painted. So you mentioned the word addiction there. There is this just widely accepted way of talking about screens and phones now that they're addictive, And not only are they addicted, but they're addicted by design. And again, it's just not borne out by the evidence. You are not addicted to your smartphone. Have you developed bad habits? Yes, absolutely. Everybody has. You've developed some good ones as well. So, in and of themselves, they don't necessarily hinder learning. So, it's more about the context that they used, what the expectations of their use are, those sorts of things. So, I
But they're
think,
not are
sorry, go
you
on.
saying they're not addictive though? Because I thought they sort of like when you scroll or whatever and you see things that sort of trigger like dopamine hits and stuff. Like, is that not? I don't know whether that in young people would cause addiction or is that just rubbish? I'm not a scientist.
So,
I don't. Yeah.
So clinically, they're not addictive. Clinically, there is no such thing as smartphone addiction or social media addiction or anything like that. The only formalized clinical digital addiction is gaming disorder, and even
Right. Yeah.
there is a lot of debate and a lot of disagreement among scientists about whether it should be classified as that or not.
As an
So
addiction.
a lot of this comes from we kind of inadvertently misuse the language of addiction. We say that we're addicted to things when actually we mean we use them a lot. We use them a lot when we feel like we don't want to be using them a lot. And actually, sometimes we mean it when we like using things but feel as though we shouldn't use it a lot. That's very
Mm.
different to full blown clinical addiction. And I think where that gets us unstuck is we start talking about things like dopamine and dopamine hits and things like that. And if you start diving into the neuroscience behind how, at a biological level, addiction works, it's very different to what's happening when we're on our phones, right? So I spent an entire chapter in my book going through this, and it's always the one that I've been a bit nervous about because it's the one where I think I'm sticking my head above the parapet a little bit because we all talk about addiction in these sorts of uncritical terms, but I don't think the evidence supports that from the scientific research literature. I think when we talk about things like infinite scroll or whatever
Mm.
the particular thing is that we're worried about at this particular point in time, they are things that are very convenient and enable us to develop habits. Absolutely, they are habit forming machines. But habits in and
Yeah.
of themselves are neutral. Whether they become bad habits or good habits or not depend on other factors around us.
Okay. Like.
So the sorts of support networks that you've got around you, people that you talk to about the particular habit that you're getting involved in. I think one of
Yeah.
the examples that I use in my book is just very simply like phone checking behaviors, right? So if you think about checking your phone, that in and of itself is not a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing.
Yeah.
When you do it can make it good or bad. So if you're checking your phone a lot at night because you're feeling a bit lonely and you want to connect with friends, that's maybe a good thing. If you're checking it a lot at night for no particular reason when you should maybe be going to sleep instead, that's probably a bad thing. If you're driving down the road, checking Twitter just to see what somebody's written that day, super bad habit to get involved in. So it's those other
Yeah.
contextual factors. So it's not just the behavior itself. It's things like how often you do it, but critically how often you do it in a way that doesn't align with any particular goals or aims that you have.
So you mentioned there wasn't much research in terms of it being an addiction or addictive, right? Or trials or whatever, right? There's nothing to say that mobile phone. But what research is there that exists to suggest that there are sort of benefits or negative effects of somebody using a phone regularly? Does anything like that exist out there?
So, just as a point of clarification, there is a lot of research out there
Yeah.
on phones and social media and internet in terms of whether these things are addictive or not. I think the problem with it is that they all largely suffer from the same issues in that they take these sorts of behavioral addictions as given as already existing. What we've
Right.
struggled to do over the past 20, 25, 30 years or so is go, well, hang on, is this thing a unique disorder? Is it something that we should be worried about? Or is it better characterized as some other sort of problem for a particular group of people?
Got you.
So that's a bit of a harder sell, I appreciate, because like I say, if you go and do a search for papers in this area, there are literally thousands of them.
Yeah.
I just don't think any of them, or many of them, are very good. And they're not kind of moving the needle in terms of our understanding of what actually is going on when people use phones. So that was first bit. Sorry, what were you asking me more
I was
generally then?
asking you overall, does the research say that regularly using a mobile phone is a good or bad thing?
So there's, it depends what you mean by good or bad, I suppose,
It
in a way.
does. A
Which
positive,
actually is like,
negative.
it's a super big problem with the research. So
Yeah.
even if you take that as what are the effects of using phones or screens on mental well-being, there are so many ways in which phone use or screen use is operationalized within a study. So how you decide what you're measuring as phone use, and there are so many different ways in which you can measure or define well-being, that what you end up with is this literature that's, I mean, it's everything, right? So you can find
Yeah.
studies that show positive effects, you find studies that show negative
Yeah.
effects, big effects, small effects, no effects at all, depending on what specifically it is that you're looking at.
Okay. So what about, because obviously we're going to get in more into sort of a school context in the next sort of hour or whatever. We're going to talk
Mm,
about mobile phone bans in schools, right? So we've sort of established that there's a lot of research out there on phones. We've established so far that there's not a whole lot in terms of saying that they're addictive, that
mhm.
they are addictive. And also, there's huge amounts of research that suggest positive and negative outcomes from mobile phone use. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, and I would say by and large, they're all what we call small effects. So we're not seeing like big things impacting people either way.
Yeah. 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 So, one of the things, so thinking now more specifically about schools and young people, um, one of the things that I've come across before, and one of the things that I'm sure a lot of teachers have noticed this over the last 20 years, let's say 10 to 20 years, is attention spans seemingly getting shorter, and many have associated that with the increase in social media specifically. I mean, we're talking about mobile phone use, but obviously we're accessing social media via mobile phones. The desire to get a mobile phone and look at social media, right?
Mm.
Any thoughts on that? Is that a myth? Is that like, yeah,
So again, it depends what you mean by attention span in a way. So that, again, this
how?
is something that I went into
Yeah,
in the book, that and you see these sorts of headlines. You have seen them increasingly over the past couple of years. That, that our attention spans have crashed because of these sorts of distraction devices and things like that, or our attention's collapsed and we can't concentrate on things anymore. And it feels like that, right? So I've got experience of this myself. I feel like I can be very distractible sometimes, and I certainly think that in the context of teachers in the classroom, like you say, this is something that feels as though it's been increasing in terms of a problem over the past decade or more. That the kids are more distracted, that they're more distracted by their phones, and that's translating into attentional problems. Again,
mm,
sort of defining specifically what you're talking about or worried about, I think is really important in the context of just attention generally and attention spans. From the research literature, there's no evidence to suggest that they have been collapsing over the past 10, 15 years or so. If they did, I don't think that would be very good for us from a sort of evolutionary perspective. That
mm.
something so small in terms of time could have such a big effect. But yeah, you don't see that in those sorts of terms. I think what we're talking about here, like I say, is sort of distraction or
Yeah,
distractibility.
yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of studies, or an increasing number of studies, that make this sort of claim that just very simply having a phone around, like whether it's on your desk or in your pocket and things like that, that in and of itself is distracting. It's inherently distracting.
I've read that.
Again, yeah,
That features in many education publications. That
yes.
that bit is features heavily.
So again,
So
it's
are
not
you going
supported
to
by good
debunk that now,
evidence.
or are you going to reinforce it?
So We don't have much, so there's not much research to go off in all of these areas because the rate of change in digital technology is so fast, and we're always so slow to catch up when it comes to research. We have some studies in this area. There was a meta-analysis that was published a few months ago that tried to look at, I think there were about 27 or so studies in the area, and argued that that, again, there's just not good evidence for that effect. Now, that's not to say that phones therefore aren't a distraction. Of course they are, and all teachers have got examples of this, right? They absolutely can be a distraction when you're looking at messages or videos or things like that instead of concentrating in class. I think maybe there are other reasons why that's happening. We can talk about that now, but I think we'll end up talking about it towards the end in terms of alternatives and solutions.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's, again, it's not the case that these are sort of inherently there's something magical and magnetic about it that if it's just in your pocket, it's somehow distracting you. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can or should be doing.
Let's talk about the impact on learning then, a little bit. Do you think that mobile phones genuinely hinder learning, or is it more about how they're used? Or, do you think that they could or should be integrated into learning processes in schools? Or do you think that they should be banned?
So again, it's that sort of are they inherently bad things, that sort of approach. I don't think they, in and of themselves, they necessarily hinder learning. If you look at data on the effects of smartphone bans, it's like many other areas in terms of digital tech effects. You find some studies that show that once you've banned them, you see improvements in academic outcomes. You see other studies that show actually things get worse. So there was a study by researchers at KCL this year that showed that the higher the percentage of schools that implement a phone ban within a country, the lower the PISA scores, the lower the normalized mean scores for maths, reading, and science. And that was true as well for schools within England specifically. So schools that were applying bans were seeing significantly worse results than those without a ban. Other studies have shown improvements. So there was a study that came out of Norway that made big waves earlier in the year because it appeared to show that smartphone bans do work in terms of academic performance, and as well as things like mental health and bullying and all the things that we want to improve. With my science communicator hat on, I found that study really interesting because what it seemed to do was polarize everybody, right? So if you were already pro-ban, by and large, you took that paper at face value as reinforcing evidence. Look, here's a study that actually shows it. If you were like ban agnostic or anti-ban, there are enough problems with that study that you could lose faith in the findings. So it didn't really shift anybody's feelings on it and just sort of polarize people. But there again, that study, it was about 500 schools in Norway were surveyed.
Yeah.
And the data was matched to things like bullying rates and mental health outcomes, so things like going to specialist mental health services, things like that. And the top line that was bandied about was that after a smartphone ban was implemented, schools saw a 29% decrease in mental health problems, something like a 43% reduction in bullying, and in some cases, depending on what specific groups you were looking at, some academic improvements there. So you can kind of get these studies that go both ways, right? It seems to be the case that if you remove phones from the situation, you can either see improvements or drops. The Norway study, I think, was interesting to me for a few reasons. So that was sort of very much taken as smartphone bans work, but more than half of the studies, more than half of the schools in the study didn't actually implement a smartphone ban, or not in the way that we might imagine. So
Okay.
when I hear the word smartphone ban, I think of either children aren't allowed to bring phones to school; they've got to leave them at home,
Yeah.
or they bring them to
Put it in
school
a
but they put
locker.
them in a locker or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
More than half of the schools in that study, the ban, the quote unquote ban, was just asking students to put their phone on silent during class.
Oh,
Now
wow.
that to me paints a very different picture, right? So all of a sudden this is not just about like hard bans. It's about, well, most of them have got their phones on them still. So how are we seeing these reductions in mental health problems and bullying and things like that? It's addressed in the study. So they did do an analysis where they compared sort of severe bans with lenient bans. But then it gets really weird, right? So for bullying, there's no difference between the ban types. For mental health outcomes, girls experience fewer visits to specialist care in schools where a lenient ban's implemented. There was some suggestion that academic performance was better in the hard ban schools for girls, I think. But in terms of the size of that effect, it was very, very small. So I think we need to be really careful in this space, because no one's actually done a properly controlled study to see if a full-on ban might actually work. We know from other countries that bans on digital tech aimed at youth sometimes feel like the obviously right thing to do, but they can have unintended consequences. They can have backfire effects if we're not careful. So you asked me whether I'm pro ban or not. I'm kind of ban agnostic, really. My feeling here is that in terms of top-down regulation from government, I don't think that's a good idea, because I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach works in this sort of space. I think instead, if we're talking about a sort of school level, I think that's it's really important to give power to teachers and school leaders in that sort of space. That if you know clearly what your pedagogical values are, and there's something around technology use in there, and you've thought about it, and you've engaged with parents, and you engage with students about what everybody wants out of phone regulations, then that's the sort of best situation for everybody, and you're doing what's working for your students and your community, right? But just flat out bans for everybody in and of themselves, you can go for them, but they're not evidence based. So you have to decide what other sorts of policies are you interested in that you're prepared to not accept any evidence for.
No, that's brilliant. No, it's just helpful to get that overview of the sort of research landscape, and I feel like I'm getting more of that overview now from what you're saying, and it's less. I don't know. It feels a bit less sort of like on one side than maybe what I thought it was. From what I sort of know of things. Now might be a good time to bring in my other guest as well into the conversation, which is Ben. Ben, do you want to just unmute yourself? We'll make sure we can hear you.
Good evening. Can you hear me there?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear. Fantastic. I thought now might be a good place to bring you in, because we obviously are going to continue, talking as we do, but you're a teacher yourself. So do you want to briefly introduce yourself so people know you and what you're doing at the moment?
Yes. So I'm Ben White. Before my current role, which is a senior leader in a girls' secondary school, I've worked in education research synthesis, and then exploring the impact of data and workload in schools, and then most recently worked on a book with Matt Evans and Professor Becky Allen called The Next Big Thing in Education, where we look at kind of the big trends that come and go in schools, where they come from, and the kind of impact they have. So with that in mind, it's quite interesting that mobile phones are kind of in vogue now, because I think I'm on the call because I feel that there are things schools can do. But I think some of your guests, Dr. Etchell, is that right?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Yeah. So you prefer Pete or Professor Etchells? I just want to get that bit
fine.
Right.
Just call me Pete.
Okay, thank you. So as Pete was saying, I think those concerns about imposing things as a blanket solution is probably quite valid as well. But anyway, I've gone beyond the question, so I'm ready to take on a question now.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you specifically from your experience as a teacher in schools, and as a leader in schools. What's your experience of the direct impact of mobile phones in schools? I'll also bring in my take on this as well after you.
So, actually, my first experience came relatively late in career, because I kind of did a shift to being a school leader with pastoral responsibility just post-lockdown. And when students are coming back into school and we're managing behaviours and well-being, etc., phones featured very strongly in a way I hadn't realised in terms of shaping the life of a school. So interaction between students, well-being, behaviours, kind of risks that students engaged in. So I have more experience than I used to of that. So that's a big deal. It's not the direct impact of phones because it's a correlational thing, isn't it? These students are involved in dangerous behaviours or unpleasant communication, but the mobile phones definitely facilitate that, and without them, it'd be difficult to carry out those behaviours. So that's one side. And then you have other, in terms of direct impact, I'd go for kind of attention, as Pete was talking about. Screens are not in themselves inherently dangerous, like we use them a lot of the time. But I think learning is inherently quite tricky. It can be motivating, can be exciting, but if in my pocket I've got access to lots of interesting other avenues to divert myself in a lesson, I think that is an issue, to that distraction. And then I accept I don't think we've got a really clear understanding of addiction when we talk about being addicted to phones. I know Jonathan Haidt talks about a minority of young people potentially showing addictive behaviours, but it's not fully my area, so I'd have to kind of be interested in what Pete's take is on that. But if your habituated behaviour is checking notifications on your phone during the day, and you're doing that within a lesson, then you will almost certainly become distracted. So I think there's an issue with that. So we've got attention, we've got well-being for a minority, and we've also got behaviours. So phones seem to sometimes, or the use by some students of smartphones facilitates behaviours that are not kind of helpful or constructive within a school, and potentially displace other behaviours as well. So there's quite a bit there, I'd say. But I accept the idea that overall we don't have a RCT or a single study that shows all of that in one place.
I think one of the areas that I will ask you both about, and I'll go back to Pete in a second on this one, is around mental health of young people, anxiety. One of the things that I've come across a fair number of times is, and this has been expressed in a variety of ways, but anxiety based on using sites like Instagram, for example. So using social media sites, becoming quite anxious, quite insecure, and quite, I guess scared might be the wrong word, but I do think maybe a heightened sense of not being well in the world, perhaps because of this, and that then affects the mental health. Now, again, this is where I suppose what Pete was saying earlier ties in as well. Is that the phones, or is that the sites, or is that actually would young people be doing that anyway? I certainly think it's made it worse, but maybe not. Maybe that's just a cultural thing, and phones and social media aren't a key issue, but I'm pretty sure they are. But Pete, what's your take on the whole, on that side of things, so that the mental health, student mental health, anxiety, social media pressure, that side of things?
It's such a fraught topic, isn't it? And it's such an emotive one as well. And I think we often have to be really careful about how we navigate these sorts of conversations. Again, it's not helped by a research literature that really is not up to scratch in being able to help us with some of these answers. So, the vast majority of research on the relationship between smartphones or social media or screens and mental health is correlational in nature. It's partly because of the nature of the beast, right? So if you think about how you want to get data on this, you use questionnaires, right? So you'll ask people, and you'll ask them, can you fill out this form about rating your mental health, and can you tell us about your social media use? And you do correlations there. There are all sorts of methodological problems with doing research in that sort of way, but we don't need to go into that if we don't want to. But at the very least, So we know, for instance, that people are really bad at estimating the amount of time that they spend on screens. So if you ask somebody to say how much time did you spend on social media yesterday, they'll give you a number, but whether that number has any bearing on the reality of the situation is very different. And what we've found with some studies that have got objective measures of smartphone use. So you ask people to go into like the screen time app on your phone, or you get
Yeah.
them to download a program that monitors actually how much time they're using it. That you get overinflated correlations with bad stuff for the subjective measures. So if you ask somebody how much time have you spent on your phone, and here's like a problematic smartphone use scale, the correlation will be like 4 times as big than for if you actually get the objective how much time did they spend on their phone data. So that's one
Okay.
problem. Another big problem is
Why is that, by the way? Is that just why do they do that?
there's lots of potential reasons. So one is we're just not very good at estimating things like that.
Yeah.
If you ask, I do work on video games and how much money people spend on them. It's the same
Yeah.
sort of thing, right? So if I ask you how much money do you spend on food over the past week, you can give me a number. It's not clear whether that will be accurate or not, because we
Yeah.
just don't track these sorts of things in that sort of way.
Yeah.
But we've almost, as scientists, we've almost kidded ourselves or tricked ourselves that this is a meaningful way to collect data, right? And it's just not, because you get a simple number out of it and it's easy to do the stats with it. The other perhaps more tricky methodological problem is that nobody defines what it is that they're measuring. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there are literally thousands of studies on the effects of social media, but the way that people measure or define what they mean by social media can vary from study to study. And that's why you get into this mess where you can take a thread through that research that paints a very negative, very dark picture of what is going on, but that's a small snapshot of the entirety of that research area.
Got you. Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to that anyway. But Ben, just coming back to what we were saying there about sort of the situation in schools. Do you want to give maybe a little overview from your perspective on how mobile phone use is currently regulated in schools, and what trends you've observed in the last few years when it comes to what schools are doing, maybe what your school's doing, but what's the sort of direction of travel and what are schools doing around mobile phones?
But yeah, that's a good question. There does seem to be a shift towards more direct control of phone use. So certainly, say 10 years ago, students would have phones in schools more often, certainly in secondary schools. And then there might be a kind of out of sight or rule. I know a couple of secondary schools that I've worked in and visited recently, kind of 5 or 6 years ago, phones were allowed to be used during break and lunch times. And then increasingly phones have become something that schools try and restrict. There's a policy exchange study that's quite good at this, that just looks at what do schools actually do now. This is now a few months old. I think it might have changed a bit. But they found, I think it's about 14% of schools have what they call an effective ban. So that's not just saying schools are not allowed. They're either not allowed on the site or they're put into a locker or a lockable pouch.
What was that, 14%?
14%, I think it was around 14%, had what they would call an effective ban, where there's phones are not allowed and it's backed up by they can't be on the site or they're in a locker or they're in a pouch.
Okay.
And the majority of secondary schools then would have a restriction on phones, and students would be expected to keep them out of sight. So something like a out of sight when on site rule.
Yeah.
Students have got access to those at break and lunchtime, and depending on the school, they might use them in the daytime as well.
Yeah. And I guess at the other end, I mean, I'm just trying to think now. I don't think I've worked in a school that's been at the other end of the spectrum where it's just a free-for-all with them, but I guess that might happen more. I don't know if there's anything a free-for-all on them, but I certainly think there's schools where it is very lax, though, isn't it?
Yeah, there might be some that have a bring your own device policy, so that might be more common in some sixth form schools, and then some secondary schools where students don't have one-to-one devices. Then the trade-off is, well, the thing is, as Pete was saying, the screen isn't the problem. We've got some fantastic tech, calculator, access to the internet, Google Docs, wherever it might happen to be. Students then have access to a phone that then is used under kind of teacher direction. So then they can photographs, videos, that those allowed within school. That I think is becoming a bit less common now, but is still out there. And then primary schools, more of them are likely to have what the study defines an effective ban. And by effective, they just mean something that stops students having access to phones during the day. They have noticed an uptick in students having smartphones at primary age, but a lot of primary schools, partly because of the way that the school is run. So if you've got one teacher with a class of 30 students, you can get their phones at the start of the day if they have them, or they can go to reception and they can get them at the end of the day. So that's often what happens in those schools. And certainly just locally to me, primary schools said they've seen a big increase in students in year 3, 4, 5, and 6 coming in with smartphones. But they tend to have a more effective ban in place already.
I mean, I wanted to sort of ask you both this, and feel free, both of you, to jump in on it. But and by the way, just to say a big thanks to everyone listening along. And if anyone else wants to get involved in this conversation, then feel free to do so. You can click the little icon in the bottom left, which is like the microphone icon. If you've got a point to make or a question or whatever, then you can do that. You know, that's great. You know, that's what we're all about here is getting people involved. So I just wanted to ask you both at this point, when it comes to the use of phones in school and the learning going on in schools, you know, to play devil's advocate a little bit here, you know, this idea of, I mean, I've seen like the future proof sort of articles and stuff around AI and around, you know, chips in people's arms, which relay information straight away, you know, into visors and stuff, and people wearing like, you know, like those things in your eyes where it's not even, it's like a screen in your eye sort of thing, or a screen over your eye and all that sort of stuff, right? And even like earphones, all that sort of stuff, right? It's all integrated technology, I guess, is what I'm sort of saying. And will we look back at this in 50 or 100 years and laugh because we think, why were we even thinking about this? To play devil's advocate, do teachers need to adapt to the new reality early in the long game span of what's going to happen with technology? Or is that just looking at it and in a way of going, no, hang on a minute, that's ridiculous, because A, we don't know what's going to happen, and B, we can see negative results now?
I think you've got two whole shows in there. So there's one on AI, large language models, and the impact that has on teaching, and that's huge, and it's not going anywhere. And then actually the question you asked about 50 to 100 years time, like if we look back, that's what got me into this, because I look around, I look at the kids in my school and other schools and their relationship with their phones and the effect it has on behaviour, and the apparent effect it has upon individuals' well-being, and the effect it has on attention. And I think in 30 or 40 years' time, looking at this moment, we'll look back and think, why didn't we do something about this earlier?
Yeah.
So why
look at it like smoking sort of thing?
Well, I think that's a really good question. The good question is what we think it's like. So I think to some degree we might look at it like smoking, in that there are age restrictions now that we don't think about at all, like they've come into play. I think potentially, and I tried, Pete, to look at your book, although I only found out that you were joining us a few days ago, so I only looked at the free pages available on Amazon, and I saw in there that you mentioned the analogy of diet, and I like that idea when it comes to kind of screens and tech, because I think that might be how we look back at social media in terms of how we might regulate children's access to sugar, say. So sugar's not inherently bad, but you wouldn't trust your child to regulate their own sugar intake. Sometimes I go stronger and think it might be more like alcohol, like same thing, you know. But anyway, I've sort of let you jump in there.
Yeah, so this is a sort of digital diet approach that researchers like Amy Orban at Cambridge have argued is a good analogy. Sort of this idea of thinking about sort of a flip way of thinking about it, I guess, is, you know, if you ask what's the effect of eating food on your waistline, it's a pretty pointless question to ask, because the actual answer is it depends, right? It depends on lots of other different things: what food you're eating, how much, when, who with, are you doing exercise, all of those sorts of things. So thinking about our digital diet, our technology diet in the same sort of way, I think can be quite useful. So one of my favorite examples from that is, you know, the idea of like a high calorie protein bar or something like that. You know, that in and of itself is not good or bad. If you're eating it, you know, either before or just after doing a marathon or something, that's a good thing. If you are not somebody who exercises much, and you're eating one in bed just before you go to sleep, it's probably not a great thing to do. So part of this is around understanding what this is that we're consuming, and figuring out the right ways to use it. And I think that's the big thing for me in these conversations around things like smartphone bans, is we talk about it sometimes, not very often, and we don't talk about it enough, which is that if you're talking about smartphone bans, you cannot do that without talking about how you build digital literacy skills in kids. Because without that part of the equation, it doesn't matter. Like, the ban thing is going to be entirely pointless unless you think that there's some magic age that kids can get to where before that they're going to have problems with tech and afterwards they're not. That's not how it works, right? And I don't think we're making enough of a song and dance about the building the literacy skills from a very early age, and also critically building them in parents and caregivers as well, to be able to support young people with this sort of tech use. And, you know, you say about in 50 years time or in 100 years time, are we going to look back and laugh at that, what you know, what we're thinking and worrying about now? The answer to that is maybe. Like, you know, we've seen cycles of moral panics around digital tech for as long as digital tech's been around. You know, we saw it with radios and TV and landline telephones in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and video games and things like that. You never know whether you're in a moral panic until you get out of it, right? So it's not possible to say, is this just the next moral panic at the minute? Because we don't know, because we're still in it. It feels like there's a lot of the hallmarks of past moral panics you see in this one. But regardless of whether it is or not, I think the thing that we need to be thinking is, how do we get out of this cycle? And the way that we get out of this cycle is about thinking about how we train better skills, so we better prepare people, kids, for using this sort of tech, so that when the next technology comes along that we're all going to panic about, we're in a slightly better place to be able to deal with it.
Well, funnily enough, Pete, just on what you were saying there, just last week we were talking to some wonderful people from the Economist Foundation. Now, they offer free resources for digital, for, what would you say, media literacy. So they have something called Topic Talks, which is essentially like a vehicle for getting students to become aware of media literacy and their own access to media and how they consume media and how they interrogate media, right? And it's interesting you say that about if you're going to ban them, there should be something with that around, you know, so they can sort of be educated, but also educate themselves. Now, I'll ask Ben this because Ben might know as well, but for me, outside of PSHE, and yes, you could argue that there are certain things intrinsically built into subjects like the one I teach, history, for example, in terms of source analysis and all the rest of it, and how you interrogate sources, and English maybe when you're reading literary works and you study the works, you interrogate them, you try and dissect them, right? All that stuff. I get all of that, but when it comes specifically to digital media use, and how you use it and how often you use it and the way that you use it and all that sort of stuff, I'm not sure how much we really do. How much we have time to do, I think would be an interesting one as well, because the curriculum's just so rammed right now that I'm not sure there is time. However, it is worth just like saying, yeah, I'm not sure in that area, You know, the stuff we were talking about last week with the Economist Foundation, it was a bit like, yeah, I was left thinking, how much of this did we do, you know? Ben, what do you think of that? What Pete said about bans versus education?
I think you
I
got
say
another show
versus
there.
and education.
Yes, so you got another show there on the curriculum and what we study and why. But also, I think there is more space to help young people to reflect on, like, critically on the messages they receive via social media, what they're engaging in, and I think there's probably scope to improve the resources and the places that we provide that input to students. However, I also think there's a degree to which the reason I'm behind a ban is because that wouldn't be enough in itself. So for me, like, regularly engaging in certain thought patterns, I think there's pretty good evidence that changes the way that someone thinks and understands the world. And that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of behind the idea that we can restrict access to social media, particularly for young people, because it seems to have that effect of changing the way they understand things. And that's not something we have direct control over as well. So it's a little tangential to the school ban, but I'm quite interested in what seems to be happening to young people and their views about the world. So there's some research picked up by The Guardian and The Times earlier this year that looked at young people's attitudes towards politics and gender and immigration and sexuality and feminism. And something that seems to be happening in kind of the last 10 to 15 years is that there's a divergence between young men and young women's views. So that young men are more likely to identify with more conservative views than they were in the past, and young women are more likely to identify with more liberal views. And I think for me, that's something you can teach young people about, and also as kind of a parent, but also someone who works in a school, those ideas haven't come from nowhere. And I think that the polarized world of social media has something to say about that as well. And so I do think it is difficult to say. I don't think it's a moral panic. I don't think I agree with Pete about that in terms of there being potential negatives from social media. I understand kind of that it does have a similar sort of shape, but for me, I think there's a chance, and we can't predict the future for sure, but in 10, 20 years' time, we will look back at the way social media is kind of changing our understanding of the world, particularly young people's, and think maybe we could have done more there. So I think that's not just an education issue, that's a exposure to information issue, I think.
Yeah, Pete, I don't know whether you've got anything more on that.
I think it's a really tricky topic to navigate, that one, because you can look to that sort of research, and in some ways it does seem quite worrying. I agree with Benjamin in that sense, but teenagers have always been like this, right? They always kind of push back and against the kind of prevailing narrative, the prevailing cultures of the time. So is that in and of itself a worrisome thing or not? We don't know yet. I mean, we know
I always go back to an example that I teach, which is obviously the 1950s with Elvis's hips, right? And the idea that kids and young kids were getting really overtly sexualized and stuff like that due to Elvis's hips, right? And like media culture at the time, like rock and roll and all that jazz, right? And then obviously you look back at that and you think, well, it's one of them. It's because teenagers will always sort of explore, push back, sort of there might be more sort of extreme reactions to things within groups, so I don't know, I don't know what that means, but I sort of see where you're coming from, Pete, in terms of suggesting that I see where both views are. Actually, I see the view of in 20 years time you might look back and say this was a time where we could have done more, or there's an alternative view that in 20, well, I'm saying 50 years time, because I don't think we'll still know in 20 years time, but let's say in 50 years time you'll look back and say it was hilarious that people were worried about kids picking up little boxes, because they won't exist anymore, probably. in 50 years, there'll be microchips, or there'll be visors, or they'll be integrated into our brain in some way. It'll be freaky, right? So people will be like, haha, they'll be like, haha, they were worried about stupid little boxes and how often they pick them up. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think that's where
with my own brain here.
I feel that's where Pete's focus upon, like, emphasis on the research needs to be more nuanced is really helpful, because some of the reported headlines, and actually some of the research itself, does seem to look at just social media as this blanket thing, or even screens as a blanket thing, or phones, and that can kind of muddy the water. I do think on the issue that we're focusing now, that young people's attitudes and views changing, things that do seem different would be the divergence between boys and girls' views. So yes, girls and boys used to be more liberal and push back and rebels and rock and roll and all of that. And there didn't used to be that divergence between young males and young females that appears to be emerging. So there might be something around there to do with the bubbles that young people spend their worlds. And I'm sure if we've got listeners from secondary schools, the number of young males who kind of repeat some of the messaging that Andrew Tate puts out is concerning and high. Now, they might be doing that for shock value, and it might be changing their behaviour and attitude towards women. Then the other one that, again, I need to look into more, but it does seem troubling, is this happiness trend. So historically, it seems that longitudinal research into people's happiness gives this U shape, and it sounds like all three of us, it's bad news because it's a U shape, and it starts out pretty high when you're young, and your happiness declines as you kind of approach your 20s, 30s, I think into your 40s or so, and it tends to pick up towards the end of life. So there's this shape. And again, something that doesn't seem to be just moral panic is that the shape of this U curve is perhaps changing. And now certain groups, and again, it's not all young people, I think it's young women in particular. And Jonathan Haidt's work points out it's young liberal women, actually, more so, start out much lower than they used to. So there's this, maybe it's not a panic. So I think it's worth thinking about historically what we've learned. So we have had moral panics over tech in the past. We've also had times when we haven't worried about things that turned out to be absolutely things we should worry about. So like Guy Callender in the 1930s pointing out he thought maybe CO2 linked to climate change. It was kind of shot down for a while because it didn't fit prevailing narratives, and that was the thing. Or kind of medication in the past. So when we used to give, Victorian era cocaine, cough syrups, like there's stuff there you go, oh, maybe. And I don't want to be polemical, but I do think there's a difference between kind of panicking about the radio and panicking about the messages that are reinforced 50, 60, 100 times to an individual young mind in a day. I think there are risks there, and it isn't certain, but for me it's enough to hold back a bit more than we are.
I mean, Ben, I haven't asked you directly, like, where do you sit personally on the ban phones completely, soft bans, or no bans at all?
So I have to separate my sort of parenting head and then school head. So I've got children who are just approaching like secondary age, and I'm thinking for them, I think I know that I'm concerned enough about social media to really restrict that to not having smartphones in the short term at least. But in a school, I would say the school has to decide what works for them. I think I agree with Pete there. I think it's really helpful if there's cover from the DFE or larger organisations saying, we think this is a good idea, because it gives you backing if you want to do something that people push back against. I think for my school, a soft ban wasn't effective because of the geography of the school, where students are at break at lunchtimes, and the amount of phone access that occurred. So if we wanted to restrict use to phones, we'd have to do what we're moving towards doing, which is having an effective ban with these lockable pouches. And the reason we took that step is because we surveyed students and we found that the majority had their phones in their top pocket all of the day. They're meant to be locked away and in bags, but they're quite attached to them. And then they're meant to be off, and most of them were on. And then you couple that with phone use and the 237 notifications they get on average in a day, and you think, well, probably that's not going to be sufficient. However, you have to work out what works for you. The other thing that makes it an easier decision to make in some schools is what other access to tech there is. Because as Pete was saying, there's a huge number of things that you can do with the technology that you'd want some access to. So schools that have a one-to-one device policy just don't need a phone, I would say. So it's easier to make that quick decision. If you don't have that, it's a trade-off for sure.
Just to bring in now a quick word from our wonderful supporters at Teachers Talk Radio, which is John Catt Educational and Reading Solutions UK. If you haven't bought an educational book recently and you have a desire to buy one, then please head over to johncatbookshop.com and benefit from our amazing coupon code, which is JCTTR2425, to get 20% off any book at John Catt. And also, you can throw in as many books as you want into your basket, still get 20% off. Amazing publications through John Catt from so many brilliant teacher authors. So definitely head over there and check it out. Also, we've got Reading Solutions UK. If you haven't heard of them, they're the home of Dreambox Reading Plus, which is an online reading development program which is suitable for any students from Key Stage 2 up as far as GCSE and even beyond that. You can get a 4-week free pilot from Reading Solutions. So it's all about reading development in upper primary and secondary. You can get 4 weeks for free by visiting Reading Solutions UK. So check out their website and just say, yep, TTR sent us here for our 4-week free pilot, which is available through us. So do check that out. I've tried it and it is really, really good. I haven't obviously tried it from a whole school perspective because I don't own a school to try it in, but I've tried the actual program and it's really, really good. So next question. I want to move on into the last sort of sections, let's put that in plural, which is around what are the possible solutions. We've talked about the different things that are happening at the moment. Yes, we talked about the sort of in-school things of whole school bans and sort of semi-bans and putting things in lockers and pouches and all the rest of it, right? But what are the possible solutions here? Do we need a solution? You know, what should we be looking for in schools, right? A lot of people who are listening to this will be in schools where phones are outright banned. A lot of the people listening are and will be supporters of phone bans. I am personally broadly in favour of bans on mobile phones in schools for now, until somebody can tell me that there are, you know, unless we can see that they work well. But the only things I've really seen in my career so far is negative outcomes really from phone use in schools. I'm not going to say all technology because that would probably be silly. But when it comes to phones, what I've seen is I haven't really seen much in the positive column. So I was wondering if either of you have any thoughts on, you know, what does the future look like? Should schools focus more on digital literacy, for example, and responsibility rather than implementing a ban, or should the bans be changed in some way? You know, how can we innovate this? What should schools be looking at? Pete, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, shall I go first? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very much in the camp of we need more and better in terms of digital literacy skills training, again from a really early age, and that includes parents and caregivers, but also around things like algorithmic literacy as well, so that, you know, like I said before, you can implement a ban or not, but that in isolation, I don't think fixes things for the better later on. That, you know, phones aren't going away, sort of technology isn't going to disappear overnight. So we need to figure out how we're going to equip children and young people with the best sorts of skills so that they can navigate that environment basically better than we could. Because I think this is what it comes down to, is that, you know, the iPhone appeared in 2007 and it completely changed the landscape of how we interact with the internet. And what happened there was that we winged it, right? There was no instruction manual that came with it. We, as of that generation, we figured out how to use it. And for some of us, that worked really well. For some of us, I don't think it worked well at all. But we've not enacted anything as a result of that, if that makes sense. You know, I've spoken to teenagers and, you know, asked about this, and they say, yeah, we know that there's loads of digital literacy stuff out there, and, you know, we do like Safer Internet Day and things like that, and we have these one-off sessions. We know that there's stuff out there, but we still feel like we're winging it on a day-to-day basis. And that's where I wish we could have done things differently already, but it's never too late to do that. I know that there's this sort of
But the
sense of
problem is,
urgency
Pete,
that
does
everybody. Sorry, go on.
yeah, no, sorry, I was just going to. Do you think what you're saying though relies on students being self-controlling and self-responsible in it? Because even if they know the information, they've still got to have self-control with that information.
Well, I think part of this falls down on the tech companies as well, of course, and I think they've not really featured in this conversation.
Mm,
Yeah, that I've said for a long time that fundamentally what we're talking about here is technologies of convenience, of pleasure, of entertainment, things like that. And if that's genuinely what they are, then user well-being isn't an optional extra. It's not even something that you maybe should consider somewhere down the line. It's the first thing that you should think of. It should be absolutely at the center of their core design decisions. And it's not at the minute. It's very simply not. I think part of the reason why things haven't shifted there is because it's very easy for tech companies to ignore a lot of these conversations and debates because they're still at this very sort of top level, almost kind of hysterical, phones are rewiring kids' brains, that sort of like nonsense. And it's very easy to ignore that because you can point to research saying, oh, well, that's clearly not the case. So I think if we can get smarter about understanding our own tech use, our kids' tech use, and make everybody more knowledgeable in this space, we can start asking more difficult questions of tech companies that they can't avoid.
got you, got you. Yeah, no, that is interesting. We haven't talked about tech companies. I mean, Pete, just in that sense, then, I mean, if you were in charge of a tech company now, like a Facebook or a TikTok or an Instagram, you're not the Chinese government, so you wouldn't be in charge of TikTok. But what would you do?
I mean, I feel like and I don't understand why this hasn't happened yet, but I feel like there's a massive incentive here to be the first company out of the blocks to do something about it.
Radical.
And I don't know why there's no traction there. I feel like part of it maybe is that they themselves don't necessarily understand the science as much as we maybe think that they do. So if you look at some of the stuff that comes out of their own research, things like the Facebook files and things like that. They come out and make the news, and everybody's shocked at the research that they're doing and what that shows, and that things are bad. I remember talking to colleagues. You talk to people who know how to do the research in this area, and the prevailing message when the Facebook files came out was like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. Like they really don't know how to do research in this area. So I think there needs to be much more interaction between the tech companies sharing data, independent researchers being able to do research using that data in a way that's sort of free of conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest. I think if we could do that, a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of the research in this area relies on you as a researcher going out and asking people to sort of self-report data about their tech use, when actually what we need is the objective data. That data exists already. It's in the hands of the tech companies, right? So if there is a mechanism, it's not as simple as to say they need to make it available, because there's all sorts of privacy and IP issues there. But it's not impossible. And I think if we could do that quickly and better, and there are some proof of concept studies out there that show that it is possible, then we'd know more what we're dealing with.
What did you mean? Just circling back, Pete, as well, to something you said a few minutes ago. You said it's not just media literacy, it's algorithmic literacy. What is that?
So understanding how things like recommender algorithms work, I think that can be quite an empowering thing, particularly for children. So, if you understand that when you use Instagram, say, that if you like a video of a dog doing something funny, then that's sort of informing the algorithm that this is the kind of content that you want. So you'll get fed more of it. Now, the problem with those sorts of algorithms is that they tend to be quite sticky. So if you decide that you don't want that content or that sort of content anymore, so they're very quick to learn, but very slow to unlearn. So, there was an example of this that I talked about in my book around pregnancy, right? And this is sort of something that's, I've had experience of, we've had experience of in our family, that, when you're expecting a baby, what do? You go online and search for stuff, baby stuff, right? And stuff for cots and things to decorate the nursery with. And then if you experience baby loss, you very, very quickly don't want to see any of that stuff, right? You don't want to be reminded constantly, but you still get pushed it by the algorithms. It's still, Amazon or whoever will still think that you're wanting to search for this sort of stuff.
Mm.
And no matter what you do in that sort of space, it can take quite a long time for those recommender algorithms to shift in terms of the content that they serve you. I think understanding that can be a really useful first step, and I think we'd all be surprised about how little, and I include myself in this, how little we understand about how those sorts of algorithms work. But there are some papers out at the minute that are arguing for this, that we need to be thinking about this in the context of education. Particularly if you think about this in the context of I don't know, something like eating disorders and things like that. If you're being pushed eating disorder content on a social media platform, and you're vulnerable to that, knowing this isn't going to fix the entire thing, obviously, but knowing that it's not something to do with you, that the reason that you're getting that content, I think, is an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, like what you're saying is basically you could have got it because of the algorithm and not because
you, like, quote unquote, deserve it or anything like that. And it kind of gives you a little bit of, knowledge is power in these sorts of situations. Like I say, it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything, but it's a part of that power.
And I guess that's
So I think,
go on.
I think that's where we may differ. So I agree that that's helpful to know. It's a useful thing to train people up for us to be more algorithmically sort of literate. But I don't think for a child that's sufficient. So I think that's kind of back to where we're talking about what we would do.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the fact that when phones first emerged, we were sort of winging it. I think that age 13 restriction on certain social media was just winging it. And there was no particular reason for it to be that, apart from the fact that it was low enough that more people could join. So I think what we could do is push that up. So I think there's the idea that we increase the access age for social media and enforce that more than we do currently would be worth thinking about. And I do think the diet analogy is a helpful one. And I think with children, you don't just teach them what to eat and then give them access to all food. And at the moment, like through intention or kind of lack of understanding, a lot of young children, that's the world they're in when it comes to what they can access via those algorithms. I know there's research showing that children use the internet in different ways, but for me, it's not just an education issue. I don't think schools are the sole or even the primary place for managing that. So that's a home-based decision. But I do think that's, for me, why the ban on social media-enabled smartphones in schools is quite a good idea, because I don't think young children are capable of making that decision just on willpower alone.
That's where I wanted to pick that up with Pete, because Pete, I'm not sure whether I know exactly what you think on that, because I agree broadly with what Ben is saying, in that, I'm unsure if children, especially younger children, have any of the sort of self-control or sort of ability to take on board the information you're saying that could be delivered to them, and then translate that into actual, behavior mechanisms, right? I mean, are you being too ambitious with what you're saying, in terms of, the teachers in classrooms now are confronted with what they're confronted with, and even if they rolled out a brand new curriculum program and it was deeply embedded into all curriculums, it would take years for that to see any sort of impact. Do you understand what I mean? So for now, surely a ban or some sort of control mechanism is the way to go.
Yeah, I can totally see where you're coming from, and I think there's a lot of sort of sensible stuff said there. So I mean, if we're talking about like social media bans, the practical reality of that is that I just don't see how they're going to work. Like if you think about how if you raise the age to 16 all of a sudden, well, we don't have good age verification software at the minute, and I've not seen any good solutions proposed to that. It's essentially arbitrary. What do you do with the kids between the ages of 13 and 16 who have access but then suddenly don't? And we know that for particularly for LGBTQ plus populations, like being online is a really important lifeline. If you can't talk to people at home, but you have support networks online, that's really important. I think for me that the thing is that I'm not saying give a 5-year-old a smartphone and then start teaching them. I say the teaching's got to come first, and it starts with modeling the behaviors that we want them to learn. So I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and I do this with her, that I think often about this, about before I started writing Unlocked, what my tech use was like around her, and I was modeling some really bad behaviors. I'd be on my phone when I didn't really need to be, and she'd ask me what I was doing, and I'd go, whoop, nothing, and put my phone away in my pocket. And what that says to her is that whatever I'm doing is A, really interesting, B, something secretive that I shouldn't really talk about. So what I try really hard to do nowadays is, there are still times where I need to be on my phone around her. Sometimes that's legitimate, and sometimes, it's not. I don't need to be on my phone. But being open and transparent about that and saying what I'm doing, and sharing it with her and engaging her, she's bored to death with this, because a lot of the time it's just like emails for work and things like that. But it's demystifying it, and it's showing that it's okay to talk about these sorts of technologies, because what we don't want to get into a situation is where kids hide their tech use from caregivers. That's when they don't have support networks around them, when they don't feel that they can talk to anybody about what's going on and what they've come across. If they come across stuff that's problematic or potentially harmful, it has the risk then of being so much more harmful. Whereas if you've got those support networks in place, then at least you can kind of mitigate what those risks are.
I guess, though, there will be many out there who would argue that we're currently up the other end of the extreme spectrum to what you're describing. That's a problem that we might have if we sort of, I don't know, introduce bans on social media up to the age of 16 or something. And also on that note, do you not think that with age verification and stuff like that, that scanning passports that you have to do for not even passports, like even birth certificates, official documentation, scanning those in, like you have to do, like now if you want to get LinkedIn Premium or X, there's different, get advertising revenue off X or whatever. You've got to do these things, right? So do you think that's something that could not be applied to under 16s with parental, sort of a parent has to do it for? I don't know. Something along those lines.
I mean, I think it's a very dangerous, the slippery slope there in terms of where that data's held, who it's held by. Children have rights. Another thing that we've not really spoken about here is the UNCRC. Children have rights in sort of digital environments, and that's not to say, oh, therefore they should have access to everything as an adult would, but it's thinking more carefully about how do you create safe online environments for them so that they can seek out and learn things and develop skills and get information, but in a way that it also doesn't translate into harm. Those are the really difficult questions, and there's not the problem with all of this, right, is there's not a simple solution. So it's difficult to talk about these like simple solutions, effectively these one size fits all solutions, because there are problems with all of them.
Ben, I wanted to ask you, because you seem to be more of a proponent of sort of, I'm not saying like blanket bans, but certainly more of a proponent for controls. You've mentioned maybe raising the age on social media, stopping mobile phone access during certain times, all that sort of stuff, right? The sort of control mechanisms. So my question to you would be, I guess, touching on what Pete said around the benefits for young people of access to social media, like Pete rightly mentioned, kids who are trying to figure themselves out being able to access certain communities that might help them to do that online. that might be almost impossible for them to do face to face. Also, social media can give you the option of more an option of anonymity. But in saying all that, there's other websites that would be able to facilitate that as well. But I was going to ask you, so for example, with a blanket mobile phone ban or anything along those lines, does that limit students' access to educational resources, for example, even through social media? Does it prevent parents from being able to easily stay in touch or keep track of their kids if they don't have phones or they don't have this and that to do it?
So there's lots of issues wrapped up there. I think there is a case to make for like national level restriction or limit of access to social media for young people because of the effects it has. I think I'm more skeptical than some about the tech companies and what they're incentivized to do. I think they might present as pleasure and entertainment kind of manufacturers, but they do want our attention. And I think the idea that they would actively kind of restrict the use of one of their big usage groups is an interesting thing. There is some movement there, like the EE have come out with their suggestions that young children shouldn't have access to smartphones until at least 11 or 13. It should be restricted, but that's a separate question. I think in schools we know enough to say, well, if you're teaching students effectively and they've got access to technology you think is constructive and helpful, I can't see a strong argument for students having access to phones during the day. I think the impact on behaviours, both immediate and long term, in schools is an issue. I think attention is an issue, and the idea of the phone providing access to kind of sugary, exciting, attention grabbing stuff is a good one. So for almost all students, that attention's an issue. For a lot of students, behaviours is an issue. Either some kind of encouraging bad behaviours, but for many, it's displacing social behaviours with others, because if they're lonely or not sure what to do at lunchtime or break time, or there's a pause, the phones come out, so there's an issue there. Then you've got the well-being as well. So I think for me, we know enough to restrict access to smartphones within school. And I don't think it's a lot. I think it's always going to be like a clunky solution. So yes, at the moment, students do find kind of comfort and connection to people with like a particular niche interest, or minority groups, or like say LGBTQ students can access communities using the internet and often social media that wasn't available before. And I think that's where, you wouldn't maybe remove that from people for their entire day, but during the school day, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And in terms of parents contacting students, I think in the main, that being restricted is not a bad thing. So it's a bit sweeping, but I think it's probably in the long run good for the young person and the parent, for that student to be apart from the parent at school for a day. If there's an emergency, parents can contact the school. I think sometimes this kind of being always connected, I forget the author's name, but they write about people who are constantly connected to their phones being permanently elsewhere. And I think that if there's a permanent connection with home, I'm never fully absent and never fully at school. And I think that comes from a really good place from parents. You can have a difficult day today, I'll check in with you. We can message at lunchtime or break time and see if you're okay. But I think in the long run, that probably prevents that student from being independent and tackling that themselves. So I think probably that's where I'd stand on it at the moment.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Listen, we are swiftly running out of time. It's an hour and 20 minutes. It's just gone so fast. So a huge thanks to Pete and to Ben for coming on and sharing their wisdom on mobile phones. I'm unsure if we've concluded the show by reaching sort of conclusions on what should happen, but I think we've certainly explored a lot of the different areas. And huge thanks to both of you for sort of certainly I've learned a lot this evening in terms of the research on mobile phones and also different ideas on them in general and social media and all the different caveats with it. So that's been excellent. So thank you ever so much to both. Obviously I'll give a final shout out to our supporters on the show tonight, John Catt Educational and Reading Solutions UK. Thank you very much to them for supporting, and of course a massive thanks to all our listeners this evening who have been listening along and engaging. We've had lots of listeners off X as well, which is great to see. So thank you very much, everybody who has been listening, especially those who've stuck with large chunks of the show. This one will be available to listen back to as a podcast. So if you listen to podcasts, then please follow us wherever you get them, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever it is. Then just give us a subscribe and, of course, a like. And if you feel so obliged, then please also leave us a nice review, because every review helps us to grow and continue to deliver the content we do. Which is why in 8 minutes' time, you can listen live to Leanne and Ray, who are starting their show in 8 minutes' time. And you can listen live on the website to that. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. It's been brilliant, and I will be back next Monday evening at 7:30 p.m, the usual time. I've got Ross McGill on that one, so that'll be good. So yeah, definitely put that in the planners, and I will be talking about what we'll be talking about in the week. So cheers, everybody, and good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.